Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's SANS webcast, the State of Cloud Security panel discussion, sponsored by ExtraHop and Sysdig. My name is Carol Auth of SANS, and I will be moderating today's webcast. Today's featured speakers are Dave Shackleford, SANS Senior Instructor, Jim Rivas, CEO, Cloud Security Alliance, Pavan Shankar, Product Marketing Manager at Sysdig, and Eric Thomas, Director of Cloud Products at ExtraHop. If during the webcast you have any questions for our presenters, please enter them into the questions window located on the GoToWebinar interface at any time. Please note that this webcast is being recorded, and a copy of the slides and recording of this webcast will be available for viewing later today and can be found on the SANS registration page. And with that, I'd like to turn the webcast over to Dave.
Awesome. Thanks, Carol. And hey, thanks everybody for joining us. Really excited to have this opportunity to really have a better discussion around some of the things that we found coming back from the community in this year's cloud survey. And so just as a note, the cloud survey was sort of formally or officially released last week. And we got a ton of really interesting data that came back. So it's going to be exciting to have a conversation here with Jim, Pavan, and Eric around just what happened out there, the kinds of things that we're seeing not only from the community, but in the marketplace and in the industry. There has been so much going on over the past few years that it's great to, sort of circle back and get a conversation going with those that are active in the community. So again, good stuff. I'm going to kick us off, and I'm going to go through a brief summary of some of the results, which if you attended the webcast that we recently had, you'll see a little bit of a recap there. But for those of you that couldn't join us in that webcast, what I want to do is at least hit the highlights. I want to bring out some of the key points that shook out from this year's data that came back, because there's some really interesting stuff that I think, some of it I expected. I certainly saw some trends over the course of the past few years that I'm sure quite a few of you guys saw as well, just things that have been trending and happening. But at the same time, there were some really interesting points that I don't know if I would have expected what they looked like, coming into this survey. So I'll go through a little bit of that, and then I'm going to flip us over into our panel discussion. And we've got a couple key focus areas that we went through and selected, again, primarily driven from what came back in the survey, just looking at some of the detailed information that you guys in the community provided to us, telling us what you're doing, where you're struggling, what some of the big challenges might be, what sorts of things have actually happened to you in your organization when you start moving out into the cloud. So we again picked a couple things, and we got some awesome panelists here to have that dialogue with you guys. So with that, let me go ahead and spend a few minutes just really leading in and kicking us off. There were a couple key things that stood out this year, and looking through the data, all of it's interesting. I mean, we definitely saw a lot of sort of useful and practical information, but one of the things that really jumped out at me immediately, having read through the results when we first got them back in, was a fair shift in actual unauthorized access. We really saw that happening, and that's something that we're going to explore a little bit more as we get into our panel discussion. Is what are some of the reasons that this happened? Why does this seem to be increasing? So from our last formal survey that was released in 2017 up until now, so a 2-year span, I mean, you can see the numbers for yourself. This was 19% coming back in 2017, and pretty close to a third of the organizations that in fact had some sort of a breach or attack experience in the cloud. We actually saw this stuff happening. So that's not a good sign, by the way. That's maybe my Captain Obvious statement of the day. That is definitely not a good trend. And I think we did shake out some good reasons for this, which we'll talk about here momentarily. We saw a lot of frustration this year. And so that's not to say that we didn't see the same types of frustrations back in 2017 in our last survey. We definitely saw some of those, but we saw somewhat of an escalation in a few places. And the one place that I think really stood out for us, that people came back and said, hey, we just can't get what we're trying to get. We can't get the type of details or the kind of data that we feel like we need from a security perspective. It was absolutely low-level logs, system information, things that people really sort of need to rely on. There were some changes. So not all of it was bad. 2017, over half came back and said, we were really, really frustrated. And only 30% said that here in 2019. So I'll chalk that one up as a good one. But we definitely saw some growth in a few others. And again, I think there's this perception that working with the providers is, I don't know that it's getting more difficult or what have you. In fact, I might argue it goes the other way, which we'll talk about here momentarily as well. But there's still some of the exact same problems bubbling up, right? People just feeling like they're just not able to get some of the different things that they need. And in particular, it is mostly forensics and incident response oriented. When people are experiencing problems, and as I mentioned in the first bullet point on this slide, they're obviously experiencing some problems. You're going to need to go get some detailed data, or at least as much detailed data as you can pull out of the cloud environment itself to be able to help figure out what went on. And that's still a struggle. So we'll talk about that. And in fact, I think it's a big part of our discussion is to talk about that. And, of course, what are we going to do about it? Final point that I thought was a good, strong finding in this year's survey was really around third-party vendor management. I mean, the supply chain is such a big topic of conversation in the security industry today that I think there's a lot of ways we could go with this. We really didn't focus on that element per se in the survey questions. We didn't really, do a deep dive down into, third-party risk and the assessments that you might go through when you're performing those reviews of providers or of, vendors that you're working with. But we asked a few questions just to get the sense of whether or not people felt they were at least getting some data back and which data and which reporting was proving most valuable. And the one that shook out at the top was ISO 27001. And this is a pretty consistent response. We definitely have noted over the course of the last couple of years that has stayed sort of towards the top of the list because there's some maturity there. I think people feel comfortable with that. And the leading providers have those reports available. But as we'll talk about a little bit more too, as we get into some of this, that's not the only standard out there at all. And in fact, it's sort of a free-for-all in many ways. There's a lot of organizations that are getting lots of different reporting back from their providers and, sort of using all of it to some varying degrees. So I did mention that because I think it's important to feel as though we're getting some details back from the providers, telling us about the security posture of their controls and what they're doing to try to help defend us against attacks themselves, because obviously we have to rely on them for that. But as again, we'll talk about, there's more than just those. So let me get into some of the other specifics in this survey that came out. I think, again, I already mentioned the whole thing about outsiders, and obviously anybody that we didn't approve getting into our cloud environment, that's definitely unwanted, right? So as in 2017, this was definitely still a significant finding. People are experiencing attacks. The attackers have figured out that the cloud is out there, and in fact, the surface area is growing that gives these guys the ability to come and attack us. So sure, I don't think it's a big surprise that we're seeing those attacks come in. But unauthorized access to data is never something good. The second thing that was really standing out as a concern, right, the real concerns that people were just worried about happening, was the inability to respond to incidents. People just don't feel like they're capable of performing incident response as well as they normally have been able to within their own data center environments. So we saw some growth there. In 2017, just under 50% said that this was an issue, but over 50% came back and told us so this year. So this moved up significantly ranking-wise, but still, right around half, I'd say, people saying, we just don't feel like we're able to do as good of a job as we would like to. Some of the other concerns that people voiced were just lack of visibility into what's being done in the cloud. This feeling that we're sort of operating in a black box, or that we just can't get the detailed types of information we would want from the provider environments. And some of that, to be honest, is because the traditional tooling we've relied on, sort of presumes that we have control over the environment itself. So on premise in the data center, you have control all the way down to the hardware level, whereas in a cloud provider, you're dealing with a software-defined environment where, you might not have the ability to tap in and get network traffic the same way and so forth. So there's a lot of things I think that are changing, and people are realizing that, hey, they are changing and we're having to adapt to that. But right now, most organizations haven't necessarily gotten to that point where they feel confident in their ability to see what's going on and maybe do something about that. Obviously other cloud tenants, we've always seen people concerned about this. In other words, am I in a shady neighborhood and I don't even know who my neighbors are? Well, that is a factor. You are in a multi-tenant situation in most cloud deployments, and you don't necessarily have that insight or visibility into who's around you within the environment. You're really relying wholly on the cloud provider to keep your assets and data segmented from the other tenants within those environments. So, yeah, I think there's always going to be concern there. In fact, it wouldn't surprise me for the foreseeable future if that comes up as, a top 3 or top 5 issue that people are worried about, just because that's something that we don't have the visibility or control. And that makes people nervous in its own right. One of the things we built on, and so this goes back to the whole discussion around the threats and the types of things that people are concerned with. But it's one thing to be concerned, as any security professional could tell you. There's one thing to be concerned, and then it's another to see things happen. So while I do think there's value in just asking people, hey, what are you worried about? What kinds of things? If you're sitting around saying, hey, let's do some threat modeling, is there a chance that we could experience some issues here? Well, sure, that, again, that has merit, but we really need to find out what types of issues occurred. So we asked people, hey, did you actually experience a breach, or did you experience a successful attack? And some folks, of course, did. Now, to be fair, the numbers there are relatively low. So we didn't get an overwhelming response back from the community stating that there had been, in fact, real intrusions. In fact, the number was very low. I think, if I recall correctly, it was roughly about 10% of all the respondents that said we definitively had an attack. We know we had some ingress here. And we had about another 10% that said we think we had an attack, but we couldn't necessarily prove it definitively. So you put those together, that's 1 in 5 organizations either having an actual attack that they had to respond to, or having something that wasn't normal, and they had to go at least take a look at it. So that's not a huge number, but it's enough to be concerning. The number one problem, though, that, necessarily had, I won't call it an attack, but I'll call it some sort of incident. It was downtime. It was just issues. And I think going into, you guys are paying attention to what's happening out there in the industry. Part of that is, it's something that we can't always inherently control. Microsoft very recently has had some significant outages, and that's not me picking on them. It's just what it is. So there's been really nasty outages in Office 365 and Azure. Amazon had a pretty significant outage a few years ago in S3. Like, if we go back across the major cloud providers, pretty much all of them have had some issues along the way. They're third-party providers. They're going to have some problems. So this comes back to contractual agreements and SLAs and all that fun, exciting stuff. But that was definitely the number one problem that people had. And the big change was that significant increase in unauthorized access. So 12% reported that problem explicitly in 2017, whereas this year we saw 28% coming back and saying, yes, this was actually an issue. So somebody got access to credentials, or they found some API that was open, or, something. Maybe we misconfigured something along the way. There's a litany of reasons why this could happen, some of which we're going to be exploring momentarily as we get into our panel discussion. But that's an alarming trend, and certainly one that I think all of us in the security industry need to be paying keen attention to, because that sort of implies that we're maybe moving too fast without paying attention to some of the controls that we need to effectively protect our users and our assets in the cloud. There's lots of tools. There's lots of ways to actually lock things down. In fact, as I'm sure my fellow panelists will agree, there's more plentiful tooling today now than ever before, both cloud native and third party, but we've got to use those things. We've got to understand how they apply in the cloud effectively. So that's going to be a topic of our conversation. Speaking of misconfiguration, we definitely saw some increases there, particularly around APIs and application components. And we've seen a couple really compelling news stories in the past couple of years about this. Looking at how people didn't even realize that they had Kubernetes consoles on the internet or what have you. So that's no good for us. We really need to be paying attention to how we're deploying and what we're deploying in all regards, right? It's not just networking. It's not just, configuration management at a system level. It's the cloud provider configuration as well. It's this whole big ecosystem of things that have to be taken into consideration. So lots and lots and lots of things to talk about. I want to just give you guys a quick breakdown before we move into our panel discussion of just sort of what we got back from the survey itself. So in other words, who the participants were, who was actually answering all these questions and coming back to us. We had a great response this year. I was really excited about the breadth of the types of organizations that we got. We had representation in, really just about every vertical you can imagine. We had government users, we had financial organizations, we had healthcare organizations, we had actually the cybersecurity industry represented as well. So we had some vendors and third-party organizations working in the industry that also are using cloud and had lots of opinions around cloud. So we got some representation there. The technology space, of course, sort of alongside that. And we also had lots of really good sort of geographic representation too. So the predominant representation was still the US and Europe, but we definitely saw more coming in from Asia Pacific and some of the other regions too. So again, really good, strong representation from the community. And maybe the one thing that I was most excited about, I think last year or the last time that we did the survey, we really had a lot of large organizations responding. And we certainly got some of that here too this time. But we also had a nice spread of organization sizes. So we had some mid-sized organizations and a fair number of smaller ones that, to me, that shows that the cloud is growing, and we've really got to be paying attention to that. Everybody's moving out into the cloud. And again, that's something we'll be talking about here in just a moment, but seeing that it isn't just big organizations and it's not just small, it's everybody. That also tells us that we have to be a little bit more cognizant of some of the controls, some of the security that's out there. Not everybody's going to have the same budgets. Not everybody's going to have the same operational capacity to handle and manage security in the cloud. So we've really got to look at all the options that are on the table as we're building out these environments. So cloud use is definitely growing. We're also seeing more sensitive data going into the cloud. We definitely see that people are expanding their use of cloud to multiple providers. The majority still had a small number. So, 1, 2, 3 providers of different types. Yeah, that's still pretty common. But at the very high end, with more than 20 cloud services in use, we also saw some growth, a couple percentage points of growth in that really high end area, which means, we are using cloud in every possible way. So, again, that's been pretty interesting. Some frustration around forensics and response definitely came in. We saw some hybrid solutions that people were starting to try to make use of. And we definitely need some more automation and API use too, which is, again, something that we're going to be talking about here in just one moment with our panel, because this is a big one. We've got to start making use of some of the cloud native capabilities that these guys are putting out there. The providers themselves are actually offering us and putting out there. And so that's going to be a topic of our conversation here in just a moment. So I'll pause for 1 second just to reiterate. I did a webcast just last week with Jim, and we talked about some of the different survey results that came out, and we sort of covered the breadth of the survey results. So if you want to go back and really dig into all of the things we got back, I encourage you guys to go check that out. We have it archived and posted on the site. We've also got the link to the actual paper that goes along with this at the same time. So this is exciting stuff. I encourage all of you to dig in as much as you are inclined to. But with that, we are going to move along. And so I am so excited, as I said, to be joined by Jim, Pavan, and Eric. And so I'm going to start us off with question 1. This is my sort of intro question that is really all about the use of cloud. What the heck is going on? How are organizations really starting to move into the cloud in different ways? And in the survey itself, we had, some pretty interesting responses. And, again, I won't steal the complete thunder of the previous webcast and the supporting paper, but I'll give you guys at least the sort of bullet point model of what came back. We saw a lot of SaaS, a lot of different types of applications, and a lot of different types of sort of workforce apps that people are making use of, which should not surprise any of you that are out there today. In fact, one of the biggest things I tend to discover talking to security professionals, not just to IT folks, but to security specifically, is that when you say cloud, a lot of people immediately think Google, Microsoft, Amazon. They think infrastructure as a service, but the vast majority of cloud that's out there in use today is really built around software and software services. And so as you can imagine, anything that has some advantages to doing in a service model orientation versus being an on-prem install is going to bubble up as a viable contender here. So it is things like financial apps. It is things like, human resources applications. It is things like, again, the sales forces, and of course, general business productivity and so on and so on and so on. So Office 365, of course, being a pretty good example of something like that. But if you go back to some of the key things that people responded, we definitely saw some growth in some areas, and actually a little bit of a drop in others, which I thought was sort of interesting in its own right. So I'm going to kick us off, and Jim, I'm going to pick on you first, just to give us your perspective on this, because I know you and I had some conversation around maybe just the nomenclature or the categorization or definition of some of the things that we came back in the last discussion we had. What do you really think the big picture takeaways are here? What are we seeing that growth in? What are you guys seeing the growth in from your side of the fence?
Dave, happy to do that. And I think there is a lot to unwrap, but a lot of the things that stand out to me from the high level perspective is, this cloud's not new, and Cloud Security Alliance, we're 10 years old. We're not geezers like SANS, but we've been around there, and the cloud has been around longer than that. But it's changing very rapidly, and there's this constant introduction of new services. So enterprises are now adopting it to the point that it tends to be the default. And we just saw last year from analysts that said that there's more spent on cloud infrastructure than on-premise infrastructure worldwide. Just that we hit that tipping point. So what I see is that enterprises are becoming all in on this. It's not going to be everything. They're going to be very hybrid. We haven't seen that big digital Pearl Harbor. We've seen where we've seen a lot of the issues and frustrations, I think, coming out of this have been people trying to apply sort of on-premise security models to cloud, and how you said it was very virtual. And there's a lot to unwrap there. So what I think is what we've noticed as organizations have gone all in and had issues is that the shared responsibility model becomes more important in cloud because they give you a framework. Like you said, you don't have access to everything and all the hardware. Our analysis is that if you're building applications in cloud, 80 to 85% of the security controls are your responsibility, not the cloud providers. So there's this need to understand that. We are getting, and I think it's good, a little bit frustrated, concerned about things that might happen because the attackers, we know they are starting to set their sights on cloud, and they are looking at the new threat vectors, a lot more of the identity and the APIs and things like that. So the big takeaway is we're doing okay. We are more concerned. This is the default. We've got to do cloud native security. And when I talk to a lot of enterprises, they tell me they need to level up the skill sets of the people they have to really go read the white paper specifically about cloud security, go get the training specific to this, and let's build the right architectures using all this ubiquity of this very virtualized software technology to build much better, more secure, more resilient systems. So I think that at the end of the day, it's going to be really good news for organizations that really adopt this in the right way. Past performance isn't going to indicate what the future is going to bring, and I do think we are going to see this continue increase in attacks just because that's where IT infrastructure is. But if you build really strong cloud native security, I think we're going to see a lot of good news.
Awesome. Yeah, I think that's a great take, and certainly from the perspective of a global organization like CSA, you guys are talking to folks all the time. You're certainly, sort of right there looking at these trends. That's fantastic. But I know, Eric and Pavan, you guys are doing exactly the same thing as organizations that are creating security control, mechanisms and covering lots of surface there yourselves. I know you guys are getting that same take coming from clients and organizations that you're working with as well. So why don't we go ahead and start with Pavan. Pavan, what's your thoughts on this? Just seeing the move into cloud, what's happening?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the big picture here is that there is a lack of visibility in security, especially at different phases. So whether it's in your deployment phase when you're building applications early, or whether it's at runtime, and like you mentioned, forensics and troubleshooting, that really is a key factor in understanding what's happening in your environment and getting that access to low-level logs and detailed data. Although it's tough to make sense, it's really imperative from a security perspective to analyze all of that and generate the right insights, especially in environments that are cloud native. And if you are using containers, they are ephemeral, and essentially you need to have that data access to be able to make sense of what exactly happened long after that container is gone.
Absolutely, yeah. Complete shift in computing architectural models that people are really struggling to build their security parameters and control processes around too. So, yeah, thanks for that. Thanks for that perspective. And so, Eric, last but not least, what are your thoughts on this? What are your just general big picture sort of thoughts coming back from the survey, as well as your own perspective from just talking to folks out there?
Yeah, so thanks, Dave. Totally agree with Pavan, first of all, on the ephemeral workload challenge. But going back to something that Jim touched on, when we at ExtraHop were kind of tearing into the survey data, which we found really valuable, there was something that kind of stood out as funny to us. So Jim was talking about, and Dave, you talked about kind of the taxonomy of thinking of cloud as IaaS and PaaS and kind of the big three providers, but SaaS is increasingly bubbling up as a known category, even though it's been around for quite a long time. And so looking at that data, we thought it was really funny that the majority of people reported that they were using like 2 to 4 cloud providers, but then there was a significant number that reported 100 plus. Like it was like this huge gap between 5 and 100. And we pointed at the people saying 100, and we're like, okay, those people understand that SaaS is part of the category here, right? Those are the enlightened few that understand exactly how many they're consuming. But then kind of moving into enterprise adoption, I think cloud security, SecOps teams, are adapting to the reality of cloud being an extension of their attack surface, but one that is incredibly complex. And where the skill set, to Jim's point, really doesn't match up to the challenge posed by that complexity. When I want to underscore that, I encourage people to go out and Google AWS privilege escalation. And the first hit there is like the top 17 mechanisms for up-leveling your privileges, right? It's like the top 17. Well, that's a lot of different methods, which really underscores the fact that cloud providers give you 100 different ways to do a given thing, and it's very easy to misconfigure, and combine those mechanisms in unpredictable ways. So I think that's what they're trying to get their heads around. And I think attackers are ahead of the game in identifying that complexity as a place to be exploited. So when we see that increase in unauthorized access, I think it's a combination of the fact that just there's more attack surface in the cloud, and the complexity is very easy to exploit.
Yeah, and that's absolutely the case. And I think that's a really good point that you pulled out, which for any of you guys that are going to go back and sort of, as Eric said, tear into the survey data, which we encourage, that's a really cool dichotomy to note that there's, a bunch of people using a few cloud providers, and then there's admittedly a smaller number, but sizable enough using a staggering number of providers, right? Like a huge, huge number of providers, which, I'd say tells you that, as Jim was saying a minute ago, there's really this whole cloud first notion taking hold. Organizations are absolutely going to the cloud first, which that just represents a radical shift from the traditional way that we've handled computing and computing resources in the past. So, look, I always sort of jokingly tell my SAN students, folks, the horse is out of the barn, right? And then the horse is not going back into the barn, like absolutely not. So it's here to stay. We've all got to rally around this and figure out ways to do things. And that really leads us, of course, into the meat of the security discussion here, which is starting to talk about the attack scenarios and the attack landscape that we came about and really, sort of bubbled up as part of our survey this year. And I really focused heavily on this. This was one of the things that I really wanted to note and carefully dig into and dissect a bit, because as Jim and all of the the panelists just now were talking about, right? So I think we all agree on this. More cloud, more attacks, without any question, that's going to continue. But what can we do to try to get in front of this problem, right? I don't think any of us want to see this whole thing blow up. And whether that's, solely from our own mistakes, things that we just didn't realize we were doing, or people that are making changes in the environment and doing stuff that they shouldn't be doing, hypothetically, or whether it's coming back to, new exploitation vectors, vulnerabilities that are being exposed or coming about as a result of some of the cloud software origins in their first place. So I think there's so much to talk about here. And we really wanted to dig in and find out, in the case of people that had been attacked, what was actually involved. So you can see here that right at the top of the list, I know all of you are absolutely shocked by this, account hijacking and credential issues, which I swear, I feel like, it's Groundhog Day anytime we're having these conversations about people that are losing their credentials or having their accounts hijacked, because, well, we've had these exact same problems for years, and the cloud is simply a new manifestation of that. Right behind that, misconfiguration. So we're not configuring things right. We're not tracking credentials perhaps the way that we should be. Now, granted, there's a lot of nuance there, so I'm certainly not pointing fingers and getting on a soapbox. What I'm saying is they're the same types of problems we've had forever, and now we just have them somewhere else. Same thing with privileged user abuse or unauthorized application components or things that have been set up. You see insecure APIs coming in at just under 30% of the responses, shadow IT. So there's a whole list of things that I think we're starting to get a grasp of. We're really starting to understand just a little bit better. And of course, along with that is the notion of the controls that people are making use of, either internally managed, security as a service, or increasingly both, some combination of the two. Anti-malware right at the top of the list up there with VPN technologies. So you're seeing just those almost wholesale being adopted in one form or fashion. Going down from there, you see things like event management, multi-factor authentication, vulnerability scanning, network access controls, the ability to do some IDS, IPS network traffic analysis. I mean, I won't read that whole list to you. This is just sort of a quick snapshot from our survey. But if you take this concept of the things that happened, so in other words, remember, this is that group that actually said something transpired, or we think it transpired, and then contrast that with some of the different security services, controls, products, both cloud native and third party. These are, I think, the key questions that sort of bubble up, right? What's changing in some of these different areas? Network detection, event management, how are forensics teams evolving? And that's something we'll get to in our next question too. So, that's an area that deserves a little bit more digging. And of course, again, where does automation sort of play a role? So just perspective, I'd love to get the take from my fellow panelists to see how you guys are seeing this evolve. What are you seeing in terms of changes both from the attack landscape and the controls that people are moving towards implementing? I will start off with you, Eric.
Yeah, thanks. The network detection piece of this is very close to my heart because, of my employer, right? This is what we do at ExtraHop. So, I'll say that, initially technologies like ExtraHop took a bit of a hit and had a little bit of a setback in IaaS and PaaS. Given that getting access to the network data, in virtual networks in the cloud was sort of difficult. It worked, but it involved, the maintenance of traffic forwarders, and there was some overhead associated with it, which was, kind of uncomfortable for, passive observation type approaches like ExtraHop takes. The great news is that that's changing as, platform. So Azure is really the first one to come out and say, network detection is a first-class citizen when it comes to a security operations practice. They've built a virtual network tap into the platform itself. And, we believe the other providers are going to follow suit. So that's really coming alive. And the reason that it's important, using the network as a data source, the first is, it's ground truth. Like if you observe something happening on the network, it definitely happened. You can't turn the network off like you can with logging, for example. One of our security specialists here at ExtraHop likes to say, I don't know what the next big breach is going to be, but it's definitely going to involve two computers talking to each other over a network, right? So that's kind of the approach that we take. So we see that coming alive, and that's excellent. It's enabling a sense of comfort for SecOps teams that they can make sense of the complexity because they have kind of a common measurement approach across their multiple cloud providers. As well as on-prem. From a SaaS perspective, that's a lot easier. You can hold your vendors accountable via standards, like we've been doing in like manufacturing forever. You have your suppliers certified to a standard, and then, in a SaaS world, it's a simple matter of making sure you're enforcing identity properly. But then for IaaS and PaaS, you need to make sense of multi-cloud complexity, so the network helps you. I think automation is also coming alive in a similar way as security teams start to understand the tools available from these robust infrastructure platforms that they've adopted via, the big three cloud providers. So that's sort of, a catch-up kind of thing where both cloud, where cloud is catching up on the network detection side as well as the automation side.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's great. And it's really great to hear the perspective from an organization that has had to retool some of the traditional technology stacks because, well, you had to. I definitely want to hear from you as well, Pavan. I know you guys have a strong presence in the container arena. What are you seeing people do, especially with that ephemeral nature of the technology stacks these days?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's one of the biggest challenges is that a lot of times we see people having what I call IT inertia, where they leverage their existing security tools to address the cloud native landscape, right? And that becomes a challenge. And how we're seeing the kind of the cloud native security landscape evolve, number one, it's the fact that it's really fitting into this ecosystem, right? Before, you used to have security, which was seen as a bottleneck for operations and business enablement, but now it's really being integrated with other DevOps tools by this concept of shifting left into your CI/CD pipeline and bringing security early. So really making security a business enabler rather than a blocker. The other big thing that we're seeing is that this concept of a dissolved perimeter now, right? Now that you have these microservices and applications that are distributed in containers or serverless functions and other cloud native concepts across cloud providers and both either on-prem or in the cloud, the idea of a fixed perimeter no longer makes sense. And there are more attack vectors now, whether it's via the API, whether it's vulnerabilities in your images, other orchestrator related issues. So really having a tool that's able to synthesize all of these different disparate pieces of information together and stitch the context across container environments, hosts, cloud infrastructure to provide that security insight is key. And the last thing that we're seeing is really kind of this machine learning coming together in the runtime detection piece where SOC teams are human beings, and it's really hard for them to make sense of all of this security data. So having the ability to automatically profile your container activities to understand the behavior and generate, a whitelist profile, for example, allows for better profiling and also anomaly detection, which is key in environments like containers when they don't last for too long.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm glad that you brought up the whole topic of machine learning, which is something we'll come back to here in just a minute as well. I mean, obviously everybody out there is talking about that, but one of the things that I have certainly seen is the growth of that right along with cloud due to the computing capacity we now have. Jim, what are your thoughts in general, sort of looking at just the changes people are needing to make to adapt to cloud environments, with regard to security, especially in light of these attacks that we're seeing?
So just a quick anecdote is I talked to a defense contractor that was not into the cloud at all, zero. And when WannaCry happened, they actually it was their first usage of cloud to be able to analyze all of the log files, all the information. They stuffed it up there and they were able to find all of the infected areas in their organization. And it was only because of cloud. And so that was a big aha moment for them. So when they started looking at actually running the business in the cloud, they started to look at, hey, how do we actually look at some of the things that have already been mentioned by Pavan and Eric and others, but the fact that you can instantiate, decommission things, it's like, let's do forensics very differently. Let's go dump our current virtual machine and let's keep everything running. Let's have no downtime, and let's go instantiate some pristine containers or VMs. And then let's go do that in parallel. And let's look at different ways to do patch management. This very ephemeral nature, make that a strength to your strategy. And you know, we're all doing our research too, and we're trying to put this under that whole DevSecOps nomenclature and build better standards around how we do that everybody understands. But it's the thing is, don't force fit things, and take what is coming to you. Take those things that the cloud providers are making available to you. And we want, like Eric was saying, we want to get these guys to provide more instrumentation for that network layer and things like that. But we can build a lot with APIs and continue to advocate that they provide more of those features as well. But take the capabilities that they have and maximize using those for doing things like forensics and automation.
Yep, absolutely. And that's a great lead-in, Jim, because honestly, this is such a big question that we actually sort of spread it out a little bit and broke it into multiple pieces. And what we go back to, again, looking at the different attacks, you know, account hijacking, misconfiguration, while not necessarily at the top of the list, I won't say that it was the biggest sort of causal element of these breaches. APIs are exposed all over the place these days. And so you have sort of two sides to that coin. There's APIs that are used for infrastructure or whatever you might be looking at that could be exposed and be a problem. But at the same time, we have good APIs. We have good security controls and capabilities that are only available through that. And so we asked the question of whether or not people were able to pull from that and really take advantage of that. And you can see the results. For those that did say that they were using some of those APIs, config management, logging and event management, you know, tying into most of the core security processes and capability areas that security teams need, definitely a big one for us. And people also found that, going back to that original point I made at the beginning, they really feel like they couldn't get that data and the details they needed. Real-time visibility has really been a problem, especially communications. You know, what are we doing to try to get parity with our traditional on-prem monitoring around, you know, network traffic and things that we really need to be able to see, both from a regulatory compliance perspective as well as just a general best practice note. So lots of things to consider there. So our third question, you know, how can we get to a point where we're improving security and improving that visibility? We saw all the issues. We've seen that people haven't necessarily, you know, latched on to a lot of the APIs. What are we going to do about it? So Eric, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I'm going to take a big old pass on the phishing question, because if any of my fellow panelists have solved that one, I'd love to hear about it. You know, it's an industry-wide problem. You know, and you hear about these sort of phishing simulation exercises where the SecOps teams themselves are fooled. So that's a rough one. I don't know how we get past that. And it really becomes about sort of mitigation and detection post that initial compromise. You know, in terms of the integration with cloud service provider APIs, number one, that is fantastic when you pull it off, because we finally have systems of record for our infrastructure platforms. You know, you can just ask the providers what workloads are running out there and get honest answers, you know, in contrast with maintaining a CMDB or something like that. So that's great. But, you know, the APIs are complex, and really the integrations have to be built to purpose, because you need to, you know, sort of build tooling that applies to a specific use case. You know, it's really different if you're talking about asset inventory for application awareness and performance versus, you know, security improvement versus security hygiene. You know, these are different use cases, so you need different integrations. There's a lot of complexity in doing those integrations in multi-cloud approaches, because, you know, you're essentially now talking two sets of APIs, two different data sets. They don't, you know, necessarily match up with one another, and they certainly don't match up with what you've got on-prem, you know, which is a totally different set of config management or, you know, or asset inventory. So, you know, I think where the approach that we're taking at ExtraHop is around common measurement on the network, you know, using physical and virtual networks, you know, to measure things the same way, irrespective of where they live. So as Jim said, hybrid isn't going anywhere. And we talk to a lot of customers that say, we're going to be all in cloud by the end of 2020. When you kind of push and prod, they say, well, yeah, we're going to maintain some data center footprint. And of course, we also have our corporate HQ. The on-prem workloads aren't going anywhere. So we take the detection approach on the network across all of that. But I think the same thing applies to pretty much any system you're going to run in a hybrid context. So you want the same kind of log aggregation happening centrally. You want some kind of federated identity system that translates to the different cloud providers and make sure that you can implement things in one place, but then they get abstracted out to multi-cloud scenarios. And then in the case of, you touched on sort of customer workload APIs, not necessarily the cloud APIs, but insecure APIs as deployed by cloud customers. You really need application layer visibility. You can't do that from a pure kind of NetFlow or network type of context. For ExtraHop, that's analyzing at layer 7 for web and storage and database. For Sysdig, and I'm not going to steal Pavan's thunder. That's really kind of in workload instrumentation, and I think unless you're getting to that application layer, you're really not doing it right. And then on machine learning, I mean, you're talking about a volume of data, particularly with ephemeral workloads. You need some augmented intelligence to help guide security teams, to the right answers, or at least the right areas of investigation. So again, I think to sum it up, it's all about dealing with the complexity introduced by the cloud platforms, and then abstracting that complexity away into something much simpler, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it absolutely does. And why don't we go ahead and ask Pavan what he thinks, right? What are your thoughts on some of those aspects of adapting and morphing to cloud environments?
Yeah, absolutely. Exactly like Eric mentioned, right? We're seeing that change tremendously happening in the container and the cloud native environments. And we actually did a survey last year where we snapshotted our customers to understand the container density that they have deployed. And out of 50,000 customers that we sampled, we saw levels of about 100 to about 120 containers per host to an upper limit of 200. This was a 10x increase from the previous year. So what that essentially means is that there are just 10 times more things that you need to pay attention to from a security and a monitoring perspective, right? So really what it comes down to is that, is your instrumentation container friendly, right? Someone mentioned earlier about having that instrumentation on your host to be able to understand all of the activity that's happening. Is there a clear way to tell connections, of what's talking to who and all of that? Having an easy map to visualize all of that is key. So a subtle thing is what we're seeing, from a Sysdig perspective, is that both visibility and security are really converging for the new modern, IT operations, where a single platform that allows you to have deep visibility into your environment, as well as security, becomes critical, because a lot of times the first indicator of a security compromise is usually a monitoring alert, right? Whether there's a spike or an anomaly that happens. That can be an indicator of compromise or an identity for some sort of denial of service attack and so on. So we are really taking that approach of a unified platform that allows you to do that and giving you that visibility across your stack to be able to monitor and troubleshoot container attacks at real time.
Excellent. And I think that's actually a great sort of segue to ask Jim. Given that you guys basically see what everybody's up to in the cloud and certainly in the security arena, are you seeing that convergence? Are you seeing more organizations embrace that strategy of, really trying to get to a unified model of controlling things, as much so as possible?
Yeah, organizations aspirationally want to be able to do that, and we are sort of in this transitional area where we are going to be multi-cloud, hybrid cloud for quite a while, but I think we're going to see some more movement towards unifying that with container strategies. And it's hard to say if providers are going to do proprietary extensions to change how that's going to work, but because we do have a pretty diverse environment, that seems to be the way that they are trying to do it. Let's look at common ways that we can have our applications run, and let's make workload management a way to create a tooling that will allow us to have more of a unified security management approach. From a risk management perspective, we are starting to see this sort of convergence around, hey, if we're going to be building a lot of our own private SaaS applications in infrastructure, we've got to have sort of the same standards we're holding these SaaS external public SaaS applications, and starting to use things like our questionnaire and our controls matrix actually to measure those internal applications, to onboard them the same way they do other sort of vendor procurement.
Right. So, and again, I think this is great to hear the different perspectives. We're starting to see people adapt, right? People are adapting their processes, they're adapting their tooling. We're definitely seeing the transition to microservices, some of the cloud native tools, and it starts on premise, right? We certainly started seeing the container revolution on premise. Well, now the containers are in the cloud, and you have lots of different technology stacks emerging to support that hybrid kind of control mechanism, but we definitely need to see more cloud native aspects as well. So our final question, as we see this evolve, right, as we see the cloud native landscape evolve, what are some of these implications? What are the security implications of microservices and the cloud native tools? And maybe what are some of the benefits of those cloud native tools as we see that shift happen? I am going to start with Pavan on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is a common theme around containers and cloud native, but the ephemeral nature of these services really kind of sheds to light where, a lot of times they are up for a few minutes or even a few seconds, right? Recently, it was discovered that the average lifespan of some of these deployments are about 127 minutes, which is, just a little shy over 2 hours. So a lot can happen in that time frame for your security teams to miss a lot of key incidents. And it's also in context that containers are never typically deployed by themselves. There's also the aspect of orchestrators that you have to factor in as well. So a lot of times we see our customers running thousands of containers that are being spun up by Kubernetes, for example, multiple times a day. And having this kind of nature of not being able to see into those containers is challenging. The fact that they're opaque by nature and black box services makes it hard to gain visibility into the health and performance as well of these containers and what are the applications that they're supporting. And I think the big thing is also compliance. So really understanding, from an audit perspective, who accessed what systems did they accessed into, how are they coming in, what activity was executed, being able to show this detailed audit report to your audit teams and compliance teams becomes challenging, and it's no more of a once in 6 months task, but it's really an ongoing effort. So really the key capabilities of a cloud native security solution is really to think about an end-to-end security approach, starting all the way from image scanning and making sure your images are compliant and secure prior to you pushing into production, right? A lot of these security issues can be mitigated if you just do the right things up front. The second big thing is making sure you're compliant with CIS benchmarks or NIST or PCI, other standards that you need to adhere to, and to ensure that as you scale your cloud native environments, you're not exposing yourself to fines and compliance risk. The other big pillar is also the runtime portion. So really making sure, because of the opaque nature that we mentioned, having runtime visibility and runtime detection and security are key elements of your ongoing monitoring and security capabilities. And last but not least, the forensics. So really being able to show what exactly happened, as we also talked about earlier, is a key point of frustration. With containers, that frustration is accelerated. So I think making sure that you have a good forensic strategy in place to do incident response really completes that entire security lifecycle.
I think that's absolutely true, and I think that sort of need to adapt and converge to more of a unified model is more prevalent now than it ever has been. Do you agree with that, Eric? I'm gonna hit you up next and get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I want to co-sign everything that Pavan said. Certainly, figuring out what happened with ephemeral workloads. If you had like a spot fleet show up for 30 seconds and then go away, what did it do? What happened? It introduces a level of noise, that makes it difficult to find sort of anomalies or attack vectors. So agree with that. Also agree that you need to focus on securing up front before deployment through binary scanning and things like that. And then on the runtime side, you have supply chain challenges where, developers are moving fast to market. So they might pull down some commodified software component from Docker Hub, and then it turns out it's mining Bitcoin in your production environment, right? So you need runtime to guard against that. I think the ephemeral workloads, though, if you do it right, also introduce that benefit of, rehydration that we were talking about. So reducing your dwell time by literally just tearing down the entire environment and building it back up from scratch, without any downtime, and thereby, ejecting any potential attackers in the process. I think there's benefit to it, and I think, if there's something that organizations need to think about as we move to things like microservices, smaller sort of application design patterns and profiles, I think you can take advantage of the current cloud migration moment where teams are sort of forced to collaborate with one another. You have to get security teams working with IT teams, working with dev teams to make these migrations happen in the first place. So if you do it right, I think you can get to a place where you have more of a shared responsibility, not to overuse the term, between security teams, IT teams, dev teams, for that kind of DevSecOps type of mentality, which helps you on the skill set front, because you've got cross-training happening between security and IT people. It helps you in terms of, just your overall approach to security posture. Hygiene at the end of the day is all implemented by IT traditionally. So if you have a shared responsibility among everybody, you got everybody kind of building and securing and running at the same time, which I think presents real compete advantages for organizations that do it right.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree more. Jim, take us home. Get the final word. What are your thoughts?
So I think that the good thing of microservices, and let's throw in serverless as well, is it's a smaller environment that you have to secure. There's less factors because so much more is abstracted. That's the good thing. The bad thing is that traditional security tools, you can't put a firewall or a packet filter in front of them. So what it ends up being is you got to go back to secure software development, how you use these, secure configuration. I throw in secure authentication, multi-factor. You got to do all those things correctly. And this new environment, we have the knowledge. We can go make this even better than what we've had in the past.
That's excellent. And I think, that's a word of wisdom too. Maybe we could see some improvements, right? Maybe we could really see things getting better as a result of this. I think a lot of people don't feel that way currently, but who knows? So I think that wraps us up, and looks like we have just a few minutes left for some Q&A. So Carol, I think I'll hand it back over to you if we have any questions that have come in.
All right. Yes. Thanks, Dave. We'll try and get to a couple of questions here. This first question says, why is it so difficult to secure containers? I think maybe Pavan could address this first.
I think that's a perfect question for Pavan.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that someone already mentioned that just now, that having a smaller surface area makes it easier to understand what are the binaries that are running, what are the processes that it's talking to. So just having a smaller footprint makes it easier to understand what's going on. And the second big component to that is it makes more sense for machine learning or automation approach to apply here to understand and quickly baseline what's actually happening on your container, understanding the kind of the life cycle, and then applying a tailored whitelist policy that can secure that container and lead to a higher accuracy in detecting any sort of anomalous connections, or detect network connections that it's talking out to, or files that it's touching, and so on. So having that ability to leverage machine learning here makes it a better task and a more fruitful approach.
All right, thanks. And before we close out, let's put one out towards Eric. How should security teams map the shared responsibility models from AWS and Azure to practical controls and processes?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm not sure I have enough time to fully expound on that, because it really depends on how much of that responsibility a team is able to take on themselves, via their internal controls and more process-oriented approach, versus taking advantage of technology. I mean, I can answer from the technology side. I can't really answer from the process side. So I'm, frankly naive there. But, I think from a technology side, it's really about figuring out, the top, you got to triage the top threats, number one, right? And it's misconfiguration, insecure APIs. And given the trend toward, microservice type architectures, container deployments, you can't really do, kind of layer 2, layer 4 kind of detection. You really need to be able to decode SSL and analyze payloads to figure out what's going on. The world is trending toward HTTPS for basically everything, right? Maybe not for stateful things like databases, that sort of thing, but for the actual workloads themselves. So I think stepping through the shared responsibility model and figuring out how to apply application layer analysis to each area of the customer's responsibility is pretty much the key there.
All right, well, that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much, Dave, Jim, Pavan, and Eric for your great presentation, and to ExtraHop and Sysdig for sponsoring this webcast, which helps bring this content to the SANS community. To our audience, we greatly appreciate you listening in. For a schedule of all upcoming and archived SANS webcasts, including this one, please visit sans.org/webcasts. Until next time, take care, and we hope to have you back again for the next SANS webcast.